Hello, my name's Dr. Ollie Hart and I'm a GP and I'm Clinical Director at Healy Plus Primary Care Network and also Clinical Director at a company called Peak Health Coaching. Now, in our primary care network and in our coaching company, we believe in the power of people to look after themselves. And we believe that essential to that is understanding your body and having the core knowledge so you can make good decisions about what you do. So this short little video is to help you understand what happens in how we process sugar normally in the body and what goes wrong when our insulin stops working properly. And this is such an important thing to understand in managing obesity, pre-diabetes, diabetes, blood pressure, basically all the metabolic conditions that affect our body. So let's start with what happens normally in our body. So what we're looking at here is a mock-up of a blood vessel. So we digest, we take in, eat or drink sugar, usually in the form of carbohydrates, and we break it down into little units of sugar. So in our bloodstream, we have little units of sugar like this. So this picture here is a blood vessel with sugar in it. And we're really sensitive to how much sugar we have in our bloodstream. You might be surprised to hear that most of the time we have only about 1 teaspoon's worth of sugar in 5 litres of blood circulating around our body. And the reason why it's so low is because we have a really good system to take sugar out of our bloodstream and to places where it's needed. And we release a hormone called insulin. Now, insulin's really important in this story and it's going to feature a lot. What insulin does is it takes sugar out of the bloodstream and puts it into our tissues, into our muscles, into our brain. So in normal situations, insulin is being helpful. It enables us to use this sugar as a fuel. In fact, sugar is the most immediate, easy access fuel for us. It can help us think and exercise even when we're asleep. But as with many things in life, this quick, easy access fuel is often not the best for us in the long run, as we'll go on to see. But certainly insulin's playing its part, and we can't live without insulin. In fact, in type 1 diabetes, our body stops making insulin altogether, and we have to have injections of insulin. It's worth noting this is totally different to the condition of type 2 diabetes, which we're going to go on to talk about, where, as you'll see, insulin is usually high rather than low. So if we've had a meal, a sugary meal or a carbohydrate-rich meal and sugar levels rise, our body releases more insulin, which pushes more sugar into the tissues, the muscles and the brain. Again, usually a good thing. But there comes a point when our tissues become full. We've got too much sugar there. So what our insulin does then is very helpfully, it encourages us to store sugar as fat. And we save it for a rainy day. And in fact, actually being able to store sugar as fat is a really important survival mechanism. So being able to do that is very important to us. So insulin's doing its job really well. And we're happy to let the sugar rise up to 2 teaspoons worth of sugar in our bloodstream. And this is how it works, going between 1 to 2 teaspoons of blood sugar with insulin, taking sugar out and putting it into our tissues or into fat. Now, the trouble is, if our sugar levels were to really rise high, it causes real damage in our body, particularly to those blood vessels and the nerves they run past. So high sugar causes us to have symptoms. We feel thirsty and tired, and we wee a lot to try and get rid of the sugar. But it also causes damage. Like I say, damage to the lining of the blood vessels, damage to nerves, which is really not good for us. It can lead to heart attacks and strokes, to kidney failure, to loss of limbs, problems with our eyesight, problems with our nerves and pain, all sorts of things we really want to try and avoid. So of course, our body's really keen to do this. And so if our sugar levels do go higher, we make more insulin. Absolutely. And we try and squeeze more sugar into the tissues. With more insulin, we're pushing more into the tissues. It's a little bit like sort of packing a suitcase full. We're sort of sitting on top of it and squashing it down to get more sugar in. But of course, once the tissues are really full, we really make more fat. And so our fat stores go up. Again, a good compensatory mechanism, but in all of us, there comes a point where the body says, enough's enough. We've got enough fat stored, and actually now it's not really very helpful for us. We call this the fat threshold. It's different for everybody, but once you reach that, what the body says is we don't really want insulin to do this job anymore, and its only mechanism is to stop insulin from working so well. We call this insulin resistance. So the body's feeding back and going, look, we've got enough sugar, we've got enough fat now, we're going to stop insulin working so well. Now that would be great, wouldn't it, if we didn't have sugar still coming in. But the trouble is, if we still have sugar coming into the system, then we're in this real dilemma. And actually, what wins out is trying to protect our blood vessels. So the body continues to make more insulin. Because it's not working so well, it really has to make more insulin to keep up. And you get in this vicious cycle of the tissues being full, more fat stored, which makes insulin even more resistant, which means you have to have ever higher doses of insulin to keep up. And this vicious cycle actually develops over a long period of time. Often for people with type 2 diabetes, it's been going on for 10 years. If you like, our body's been desperately trying to compensate and keep up in this kind of like system of insulin not working so well, but yet sugar still coming in. And it does really well because it's protecting us from the damage of our sugar levels building up too high. Now, there does come a point, if you like, where the system just pops and the insulin just can't keep up. And then what happens is it can't keep taking the sugar out of the bloodstream. And we see the blood sugar levels rise up to a point where they go above a safe level, above the level that we're happy with. And that's when we diagnose type 2 diabetes. There's a bit before we call pre-diabetes when we know it's coming, which if you like is an early warning sign. But by the time it gets to type 2 diabetes, this has been going on for many, many years. So it really is a sort of a time to wake up and take note. We've got to do something if we want to protect our body. So I hope I haven't lost you so far. The trouble is that the temptation as doctors can be just to try and pacify you and not give you the respect that you could follow some of this detail. And I think we should try and change that. I think as doctors and healthcare professionals, we should be making sure that you can understand as much as possible. So let me just tell you a story that may help with things. I think if you take a metaphor, you can think of insulin as like a friendly doorman. Its job is to make sure that you're carefully escorted into a nightclub or a place you want to get into. They manage the queue, but make sure you get in safely and securely so that you can get inside and enjoy yourself. As the queue builds up, the job gets a little bit harder, but usually that doorman stays cool. Of course, if the queue really builds up and starts to get restless, then insulin can get a little bit stressed out. So when insulin gets stressed out, it transforms into a really nasty, aggressive doorman, like a bouncer. And its job now is just to manage that queue. It does it by grabbing people and pushing them into the club. Doesn't really care how packed or busy the club's getting, it just shoves people in. In fact, often he'll grab some mates to come and try and help out as well, just so that he can get rid of all the people outside and manage that aggressive crowd. So effectively what you end up with is a big fight going on, and fights are not good, are they? Effectively the body's fighting with itself. Insulin is getting all pumped up, it's got loads of its mates, and actually it's fighting with the cells and tissues. And of course that causes damage. It's not good for us at all. And this fight can happen at any age to any of us. But I'm sure you can see when your body's fighting with itself, it's no wonder we feel tired and lacking in energy, why we get brain fog, why we start to get pain throughout our body as the inflammation of that angry fighting person, fighting doorman starts to affect us. So it's something we really ought to pay attention to. So if we think about this a little bit more, of course, the key thing is working out why is the sugar building up in the first place? Where is it coming from? And this is where it's important to know that there are two sources of sugar in our body getting into our bloodstream. We do actually make sugar. In fact, we don't actually have to take in any sugar at all. We can make all that we need, and we make it in the liver. And it's worth knowing because if we're under a lot of stress, if we're not sleeping very well, the body's response is actually to make more sugar. But it's only a small part, and the biggest part, of course, comes from what we eat and drink. And here we've talked about sugars coming in the simple form, where there's small ones, single ones, or double ones. And table sugar is a great example of this, or honey. It tastes sweet, we know we're taking it in. But let's not forget that most of the sugars in our body come from these complex sugars or carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates, where they're long chains of sugars all linked together. Things like pasta, potatoes, rice, bread, breakfast cereals, where they don't actually taste sweet when we eat them, but very quickly our body digests them down to make large volumes of these units of sugar in our bloodstream. So we have to be aware of both. And So stick with me, just 2 more slides. One, not good news, and we're going to finish with the really good news. So what I want you to take away from this is that in type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, obesity, the main problem is this insulin resistance that's built up and the consequence of high insulin levels that we have to compensate. That's really what causes all the damage. Insulin should be this friendly doorman, but when it turns into this aggressive kind of fighting bouncer, we get in real trouble. Because insulin, when it's in its aggressive state, makes us grow. It makes us put on fat. It causes cancer. It causes inflammation in the tissues. It's a real aggravator when it's wound up. So when we have high levels of insulin, we really get into trouble. And of course, what high levels of insulin do is it encourages this fat tissue deposition. What started off as a compensatory mechanism then becomes a real problem because it further stops our insulin working and aggravates this insulin resistance. And we know that this insulin resistance, the high levels of insulin, are really closely associated with causing raised blood pressure, harmful balances of cholesterol and fats in our body, and of course this backup of blood sugar and obesity because it's laying fat down the waist. And we call all these things metabolic syndrome. And anything in medicine that we call a syndrome is not good news. It causes inflammation, which causes pain in our joints. It causes heart disease and strokes like we've talked about. And interestingly, in COVID-19, we saw that actually this metabolic syndrome, our body not working well, was a real risk factor for infections like COVID-19. So let's finish with the good news. We can do something about insulin resistance. In fact, we can actually fully reverse it in almost everybody. And how do we do that? So there's 2 main things. The first thing, you'll not be surprised to hear, is just to take the pressure off the system. And we do that by reducing the carbohydrate going into the bloodstream. That immediately takes pressure off the insulin system. But of course, we need to do that by not telling people what you can't eat and making it feel restrictive, but making sure that we've got a really delicious diet that you enjoy. And I know that for everybody we can find that. You may be very surprised at what you can eat when you're reducing carbohydrate stress on the system. And it's just a little caution. We ought to just make sure we keep in mind that carbohydrate being made in the liver. So think about sort of stress and poor sleep and the role that exercise can play in helping us to burn off sugar. But that's another story. But in the longer run, what we're actually trying to do is lower that stored fat level so that we can burn off the excess fat and get us below that fat threshold. That doesn't mean to say necessarily getting us super skinny, but just getting our fat stores back below the fat threshold so our insulin starts working again. And there's really good ways of doing this. Obviously, lowering the carbohydrate over time helps, but periods of fasting, which may just be a case of extending your overnight fast a little bit, is a great way of getting the insulin working again because it's not having sugar pressurizing it. It can relax and turn into that friendly doorman again. And there are other techniques as well to encourage the body to burn fat instead of sugar. And again, that's what we'll teach you more of on this course. Thanks for listening. I hope it made sense. Please go back and watch it again. It's just so important that we respect you enough to take you through this so that you really get it in your head and then you can make really good decisions about what you eat, how you lead your life so that your body's working at its optimum state and we can fully reverse insulin resistant and type 2 diabetes.